Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Time Traveler's Magic, Book 1 of the Magic Bound Saga by Anna Applegate, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. How long can a person go on hearing non-existent voices before they're considered insane? Ember Brighton snuck toward the back of the Moshulu's main deck. She wasn't crazy. Well, at least she hoped not. It was totally normal to come to work early just to find the voices only you could hear and no one else knew about, right? The hairs on the back of her neck rose. It was happening again. That feeling like someone was watching her. To be honest, Ember didn't need anything else making her feel like a freak. She paused and shook her head, closing her eyes. Between the voices and the constant nagging feelings that she was being followed, she worried she might really be crazy. She wondered how long it would be until someone thought she belonged in a psych ward. It felt like a hovering black cloud threatening to descend at any given moment. She turned slightly, peering over her shoulder, making sure she was still alone. She chuckled to herself, but there wasn't a bit of humor in her laughter. She still had a sense of uneasiness settling inside her stomach, a feeling that had been building since her parents' accident. Ember shifted, refocusing on making her way to the area of the ship-turned restaurant where the voices were always the loudest. Usually, the closer she got to the inventory room, the stranger she felt, which made perfect sense. The inventory room was the least favorite place for her coworkers to go. Everyone teased each other, saying it was haunted. Maybe it was the constant kidding around that had Ember imagining something more. She neared the door, only to find that the whispers in her head were, in fact, louder, yet they jumbled together so she couldn't make out any distinct phrases. She touched the handle, wondering if she'd catch someone inside or find an empty room. Before she could enter, she heard a sharp, angry voice shouting her name down the passageway. Ember! Her boss's oversized boots thudded loudly on the wooden deck. She paused, trying to be discreet as she pulled away from the door. Hi, Rick. He frowned as he approached, clearly agitated, and she wasn't sure if it was with her or someone else. Nice to see you taking initiative getting here early, but maybe you could clear things up with those in your personal life. My work line isn't for your private calls. Ember tilted her head, not understanding the dig. I'm sorry. Phone call line 2. Make it quick, Rick said through clenched teeth before turning and heading back the way he'd come. Sorry, Ember called out after him, but was met with silence. She glanced back at the inventory door one more time. It would have to wait. She picked up her pace as she power-walked back to the main restaurant, and she almost bumped into her coworker, Laura. Oh, I'm sorry. Ember raised her hands and backed toward the wall. Laura held the phone in her hand, covering the receiver. No, I'm sorry. Rick came up behind me and heard it was for you, then flew out of here like his butt was on fire. Ember waved her friend off. It's fine. Who is it? Laura looked uncomfortable. I just think you should take it. And she paused and bit her lip, seeming nervous. Take your time. She pushed away from the counter, giving Ember privacy, which triggered a deep-seated knot in her stomach. Pulling in a deep breath, she held the phone up to her ear. Hello, this is Ember. Miss Brighton, this is Fanny from Carver Hospital Center. Do you have a moment? Yes, of course. Is everything okay? Is my mom all right? Panic was evident in her voice while she waited for what seemed like an eternity to get answers from the woman on the other end of the line. I'm so sorry. Your mom slipped into a coma about an hour ago. We are still running tests to determine what happened. Ember gripped the phone in her hand like a lifeline. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but nothing would come out. You should come to the hospital. Your grandmother is on her way now, and we wanted to make sure you knew as soon as possible. Nurse Fanny was talking, but her words were falling flat. Thank you, Ember said in a soft voice, hanging up the phone without waiting for a response. She stood, resting her hand and head against the old phone on the wall. Then she straightened and almost tripped over her feet, trying to get away from the stupid phone. It never seemed to bring good news. Ember, Laura's voice was calm and quiet. I have to go, Ember whispered. Laura grabbed her hand and squeezed once. I'll take care of everything here, she said. Go. Laura's eyes were soft and full of pity, much like everyone's had been since the accident. She gave a small smile, and Ember nodded her thanks before turning to leave. Ember ran toward her car, but she shivered before she had a chance to get in. Her gut clenched with that same wary feeling of being watched. She let out a growl. I don't have time for this. She peered around the near-empty parking lot. The waves from the ocean crashed against the side of the massive ship, but other than that, there was just the distant noise of the city in the background. Ember turned in a slow circle. Who's there? She knew this time that the feeling of being watched had to be real. It had to be. Of course, no one answered, and she forced herself to yank the car door open and drive away. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as she drove much too fast toward Carver Hospital. But as usual, there was nothing following her in real life, just phantom voices in her mind. She hated this drive, but it had become a habit in the past 6 months. It was the same drive she'd been making since the night she received the phone call from the hospital about her parents. She pulled into the garage beneath the entrance of the cutting-edge medical facility. Ember parked and bypassed the elevator, choosing instead to take the 6 flights up from the basement to the 5th floor hospital wing, where her mother had been staying for months. She skipped up the stairs 2 at a time, taking out her fears and frustrations on the concrete under her feet. She calmed herself, taking long, deep breaths, and shook her hands out to the side before pushing through the stairwell door and onto the busy floor. She walked with her head held high down the hallway, but slowed down as she approached her mother's room. It felt like she was wading through dry cement. An overwhelming sense of fear coiled in her stomach, and she couldn't push her legs any farther. Ember stopped right in the middle of the hospital walkway. She stood there, and it seemed like everyone passed her by in a blur. She was stuck, unable to move forward and face her fears. She barely registered her name being called and turned her head to the side. Miss Catherine Petals was making a beeline for her, waving her arm to flag her down. Either no one had bothered to inform Miss Petals of how her current situation had changed, or the hospital was that strained for cash that they hounded patients' families even in their hour of need. Ember plastered a tight smile on her face and turned to greet Miss Petals. Yes, ma'am. How have you been? Miss Petals leaned over, trying to catch her breath. Fine, dear. Now I know you have a lot of bills, but these are way past final notice. I've held off calling them in as long as I can. But if I can't get a date of when we'll get payment soon, I'll be forced to send them to collections. None of us want that. Ember inhaled a sharp breath, but made sure to flash a smile again. I'm so sorry. I've got a lot on my mind. Miss Petals held her by the arm. Of course you do. Take these and get me something in a week, and then we can keep working through everything. Ember nodded and watched as Miss Petals walked back down the hospital wing. She glanced down at the stack of bills, all with large red stamps reading past due on the top. Another problem, but it would have to wait. Ember shook her head and turned back toward her mother's room, this time determined to be stronger. She poked her head in the doorway. Ember half expected to see her mother sitting up in bed and that the doctors and nurses had been mistaken about the coma. But her fears were confirmed as she rounded the corner and saw the tubes coming from her throat and the new monitors hooked up, sounding over her, and in much greater number than they'd been just the day before. Ember approached her mother, trying to hold back the sobs building in her throat. She sat down on the stark white sheets of the hospital bed and stroked her mother's arm. As she moved to hold her hand, Ember frowned at the crinkle she heard in the paper that fell from her mother's grip. It was a blank piece of paper, crumpled up in a ball, but written across it in strong black ink was a handwriting she didn't recognize. "I did it for us." She held onto the paper, staring at it for longer than was necessary. A million questions ran through her mind, and her breathing became shallow. She had no idea what the note meant. Instead of getting carried away, Ember stood, folding the paper into her pocket, and moved to focus her attention back on her mother. Whatever the note was would have to wait. Her mother needed her. She pulled the blanket up toward the short-sleeved hospital gown and saw a tiny black sliver beneath her mother's underarm where the gown had shifted. Ember pushed the sleeve back to reveal a black tattoo. "What's going on?" she said to herself. She leaned closer, looking at the intricate square design of knots bound by a circular ring. She'd never seen a tattoo on her mother before. And so the travelers face another blow. Ember jumped, even though she recognized the voice. She didn't register what was said, but she bolted across the room to hug her grandmother. "Nana," she whispered, gripping her in a tight embrace. A few tears spilled from Ember's eyes now that she was face to face with family. "I'm so glad to see you." Her grandmother smiled, but seemed like she was somewhere else. She had a vacant stare in her eyes. "You see me every day, my dear. How is she?" "No one's come to talk to me yet." "Perhaps you should call someone?" Ember nodded and pushed the call button on the wall with shaking hands. She believed the longer it took someone to speak the words, the less true they would be when they told her about the coma. A team of doctors filed into the room, looking at everything from their clipboards to the Brighton family in a clinical, detached way. Ember frowned as she realized they were winding down and had basically told her nothing. "So you're telling us you have no clue what happened to her?" Her grandmother squeezed her hand once, and Ember watched each doctor shrug or look down at her question. "We'll do all we can," Dr. Fisher, the lead on the case, said. Ember wasn't even close to being reassured. They shuffled out of the room with solemn expressions, and Ember heard her grandmother mumbling again. "Something in history, something in time," her grandmother muttered under her breath and rocked back and forth. "Nana?" Ember knelt in front of her and grabbed her hands. "Nana, what's wrong? What are you talking about?" Ember's grandmother wouldn't meet her eyes, and Ember panicked. "I'll call Dr. Fisher." She rushed out of the door and into the hallway. Dr. Fisher came back immediately and checked her grandmother. "This is a shock to us all. Maybe she just needs some rest." Ember looked at the doctor, baffled. "Look, Dr. Fisher, my grandmother is the strongest woman I know. This," Ember pointed to her grandmother, "isn't normal. Someone needs to run some tests, look at her more extensively if needed. Does rocking and mumbling seem normal to you?" "Right away," Dr. Fisher nodded, looking a bit defeated. "I'll take her to her room." He called a few nurses, and Ember watched, feeling helpless as her grandmother was wheeled out. Nurse Fanny came in almost immediately. "They'll keep her overnight, dear. Can I do anything?" Ember hated the look of pity written on everyone's face. It didn't help her calm down or feel stronger. She shook her head as she walked out of the room to see where her grandmother had been taken. It wasn't far from her mother's room, and Ember made her way back the way she'd come. She saw some women whispering at the main nurse's station and shoved her hands into her pockets as she walked by. She felt the note and stopped. "Excuse me," Ember approached the nurses. "Was there anyone here to visit my mother today?" One of the nurses looked at her with a curious expression, thinking for a moment. "No, not at all. Just you and your grandmother, like always." Ember nodded, thinking about the note she'd found. It wasn't exactly hidden. If the doctors had been running tests on her, wouldn't they have found it? Thanks, Ember said politely, and walked back into her mother's room. She was taken aback when she saw a man in a white hospital coat standing beside her mother's bed, touching her arm and looking at her with a tenderness that seemed strange for a doctor who she'd never seen. "Who are you?" she demanded. The doctor pulled his hand away quickly and looked almost embarrassed, like he'd been caught doing something. "You must be Ember. I'm Dr. Miles, Finn Miles." He held up his hand and approached Ember. She eyed him cautiously but shook what he was offered. "Are you on my mother's case as well?" "Yes." Dr. Miles didn't elaborate, and Ember felt suspicious, but she didn't get an uneasy feeling around him. "Well, the team was in a little bit ago saying they weren't sure what had happened." Dr. Miles cleared his throat. "We're still running tests to figure it all out. At the moment, we don't have a lot of answers." His eyes left Ember's and rested on her mother. "We'll do everything we can for her, though. And you." At this point, Ember was past the stage of being able to understand anything that was happening. Between her mother's worsening condition and her grandmother's reaction, she was exhausted. "Will she be okay?" Dr. Miles gave her a small smile. "Yes, she's a fighter." Ember approached her mother's bed, and Dr. Miles stepped away, giving her plenty of room. Ember kissed her mother's forehead, whispering she'd be back, and then made sure her grandmother was settled in as well before leaving. Ember left the building and made her way back to the parking garage, hoping to find some sort of solitude if she could. A cold chill skated across the length of Ember's body as her shoes clicked in the quiet garage. The lights flickered overhead, and a gust of wind flowed through, rustling Ember's auburn hair. She turned as a sense of dread crawled up her spine. As far as she knew, she was alone, and yet the growing assurance she'd had that she was being followed flared again. She had to shake this once and for all, or it would drive her insane. "No one's here," she said to herself. She walked toward her car, determined to stop letting the fears building in her gut prevent her from living. She could see a dark shadow out of the corner of her eye as it moved to her left. Ember jumped and dropped her keys. "Is anyone there?" An ominous chuckle sounded behind her, and she screamed as she turned to see a figure creeping through the shadows.